When brands show up, they need to be relevant. I don't think you say, oh, I'm going to wake up today and I'm going to consume advertising today, right? You really want to be entertained. And so I think that's really important. And advertising now has to entertain because everything's competing with everything.
All brands should operate or consider themselves to be media companies in a certain extent. And so for us, it's all about how do you create things that authentically land in culture so that it just feels authentic and unique to the group.
You're back with Created for Creatives, the podcast where creatives talk about, well, creative. I'm Chris Smith, and in this episode, we're focusing on branded entertainment. My guests are Helen Pak, Senior Vice President of Creative at Disney, and Brandon Butler, a Partner and Chief Content Officer at Majority in Atlanta. Now, branded entertainment's only part of the content available for audiences. They have choice in what to consume, where to watch it, and how to engage. So all of us working in the advertising industry have the same challenge. How do we create something people want to spend their time engaging with? When branded entertainment is done well, it's almost subliminal. The message is sort of hidden in there, and the listener almost doesn't know that they're consuming branded content. Can you tell us about a campaign you did that you felt particularly hit the mark?
I'll tell you about a campaign I did over 10 years ago. It was for the Tourette Syndrome Foundation of Canada. And they came to us and said, would you mind doing a 30-second spot about the disorder? And as we looked more into the disorder, we realized that we couldn't just tell the whole story about this nervous system disorder in 30 seconds. So we actually made 12 films, partnered with all these directors, lived with the people that had Tourette syndrome. And the result was, 12 films that ended up getting featured at film festivals around the world. And it really educated people. And I think people got a better understanding of people who live with TS through those films. So I think back then, I don't know if we even called it branded content. They were just long films. I kind of remember thinking, this is a really interesting way for brands to show up in a meaningful way.
So the brief was 30 seconds, and you made 12 films out of it.
Yes.
That's impressive. How about you, Brandon?
We did a really large campaign last year in partnership with the CDC and BLK, which is a subsidiary of Match.com. We saw some data that was talked about how, and especially, Black and African-American communities, there was a big hesitancy around taking the vaccine for COVID. And so we partnered with the CDC and BLK and actually came up with a original song remix by Juvenile. So everybody knows Juvenile's classic, Back That Thing Up, which is probably one of the most iconic rap songs of all time. We actually came in and remixed it to Vax That Thing Up. And I always joke and say that'll probably be the most successful campaign I've ever worked on. When it hit last year, it just went completely viral. I think it was over 7 billion, 8 billion impressions. Everybody was tweeting about it. People had a very strong opinion about it, but if you really sat down and listened to the lyrics and getting those icons to actually come in, create original lyrics around such an important message, actually get it out because they cared about the community. It was just that, that really good practice of creating content that lands authentically in culture, which is something I've tried to do over and over in my career.
I remember hearing about that. That's really cool. There's so much advertising across all the online platforms. It's everywhere, obviously, but then also traditional media, billboards, TV and radio. How do you you make this great content, so how do you share it? How do you get it out there and still make it feel genuine and create something that people actually want to spend their time consuming?
One of the things I've really been focusing on probably the last, 5 or 6 years of my career is this idea that, first of all brands should operate or consider themselves to be media companies in a certain extent. And so for us, it's all about, again, how do you create things that authentically land in culture so that, again, it just feels authentic and unique to the group. I think, as a marketer, a lot of people misunderstand sometimes the idea behind marketing, which is you're really kind of doing the research and all the work, and then you're bringing it to a market. And if they like it and they accept it, it should kind of take off and do the work itself. And so for us, we really try to do a lot of the work on the upfront to make sure that we're taking all things in consideration. But then also, when we put it out there, we're really intentional about who are we putting it in the hands of. I always say kind of our definition of culture is people like us do things like this. So when we look at how we get it out there, again, we're very intentional about, who are the people that are really going to take that message and carry it and kind of show it to the rest of the world. And so for us, again, we're just super intentional about making sure that when we create these things, we're kind of putting them in front of the people that can help carry that message authentically to the rest of the audiences. And it usually works out.
When I'm trying to sell work myself to my own clients, it's like, you're a consumer. How would you react to this? Don't think about it as a marketing person. Think about it as a human, absorbing content. And I think that's great.
Whatever it is that we're producing has to be entertaining because, we have a finite amount of time during our day. Probably half of it is spent working. And then the other half, you get to fill it with things that matter to you, that are relevant to you. So your friends, your family, shows that you're obsessed with, and brands as well. When brands show up, they need to be relevant. That time, as I mentioned, with your friends and family. I don't think you say, oh, I'm going to wake up today and I'm going to consume advertising today, right? You really want to be entertained. And so I think that's really important. And advertising now has to entertain, right? It really has to entertain because everything's competing with everything.
Everything competes with everything is fabulous. So I'm going to put that next to people like us do things like this. I'm making a little greatest hits that I'm going to steal and take credit for. And so, Helen, I wake up every day saying, how is advertising going to consume me today? So let's talk about the judging and the panel you're on. You're both judging the branded entertainment category at this year's London International Awards. We call them the LIAs. I feel like it has to be kind of a rewarding category when it's based around the content that seeks to entertain. It must just be fun to watch the work because it's kind of like just watching little pieces of entertainment the whole time. Is that accurate?
It is accurate. We've got such a short attention span. And as we were judging, I think we could all look around the room and know instantly when something wasn't clicking. But then, you see these pieces of work where everybody's laughing, everybody's nodding their heads, and we're relishing every moment. So I think at those times, we're looking at it just as a consumer, right? Not as a jury.
Did you have the same experience, Brandon? I know some of the content is long, and even in the radio jury, there's some branded content in there, and it's just like, if it's good, you don't mind watching all of it, but if it's bad, you got to kind of push through it. Is that your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was a great mix of content and submissions. I think while a lot of it was very entertaining, one of the things that I did notice was there was some really heavy messages that kind of came through in some of the content also. And so it was really interesting watching how different brands and partners kind of found ways to tell those stories. To Helen's point, everything competes with everything. And I think, I always tell people, you're not only competing with the next spot or ad, you're competing with Candy Crush on people's phones. You're competing with notifications, right? And if you think about just in this social media world we live in, where the thumb has become the most powerful thing in the world, right? You literally only have that split second. So it was really fun for me also to kind of be on the receiving end a little bit and kind of watch it and also kind of, sit back and think about the different feelings and just different reactions we kind of had to content, and also just watching some of the other, people on the jury having those same reactions. So, yeah, I mean, everything wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. There were definitely some really interesting pieces of content. There were some really important messages that had to get out. But I think the brands and submissions is a really great job of telling those stories.
Do you ever find yourself, there's something you just really don't like, and then there's somebody else in the jury who it's like their favorite thing? I always find that just incredible.
Absolutely. But, I always say, right, like that tension between yes and no, between old and new, between two different ideas is kind of where some of the magic happens. There weren't disagreements, right? They're just kind of differences of opinion about the content. I think we were able to have, at a high level, some really interesting discussions. And that's just going to kind of continue on as we go into the rest of the judging and really kind of take a step back even more and really dig into some of the content.
We spoke in another episode to Ben Tarr and Kwame Taylor Hayford, who are on a different jury. And Kwame talked about a lens that they used on his jury of judging the work. And it was, is it world first, world class, or world changing? Is there work coming through that fits those ideas?
There's a few that we've seen. I wish we saw more, truthfully. I know we're coming out of a pandemic and, we saw a certain trend of really sad spots for a couple of years. And now I think we're back into really embracing great storytelling. We're seeing some great work from other parts of the globe. So I'm happy that we're seeing that, full of cultural nuance. That was one thing that surprised me today, was just seeing, such a wide breadth of work from different parts of the world that you don't get to see.
And all the shows the last couple of years, everything with the pandemic, everything's so earnest. Everybody's just so serious in tone. So when you start to see things that are more fun, just entertaining, a little more lighthearted, it's so refreshing. We're seeing it in the radio jury too. It's like, just be funny, just do something funny and let's get on with it,
Yeah, absolutely. I think, this is my first opportunity to judge these awards. And the thing that I really noticed and also appreciated was absolutely kind of the vastness of the different submissions, but also really enjoyed seeing the international work. I think it's easy to kind of be in our bubble right here in the U.S. and kind of look at everything through that framework and through that lens as an American. But when you're seeing work that, was really culturally important to other people in other parts of the world that might have situations and stories that you didn't even know were problems or existed, it really forced you to kind of take a step back and really, just honestly look at it and just even learn something. So I think that was one of the things that was really surprising to me was there were a lot of pieces of content that had messages that were speaking to issues that I wasn't even aware of. Seeing that, I actually kind of was making a list as we were going of saying, I'm gonna go back and I want to watch this and learn more about this subject or learn more about this on my own. So
the branded content actually worked on you as a consumer to change your mind or enlighten you about something. What trends are you seeing? I'll stay with you, Brandon. What trends are you seeing that are inspiring you, that are kind of breaking through?
To the point before, you're starting to see a lot of work now, obviously speaks to the pandemic. There's a lot of work that was also speaking to kind of the social justice movement still of, 2020 and 2021, and those are still important messages. But yeah, the trend that I was starting to see is that people are starting to have fun again. So, I think, again, we've been through a couple of really heavy years here in the U.S. for a lot of different reasons. But now you're starting to see some work that kind of comes back that, that has value, that talks to different, I think, there were a couple pieces of content that were just really amazing. And they were fun. They were enjoyable.
How about you, Helen? Any trends that are just inspiring you, maybe you want to take back to your shop and be like, this is inspiring?
I think going back to craft and execution, again, with the pandemic, everything was very raw and, one camera or, we saw so many Zoom screens. But I love seeing that we're going back to craft, and craft really matters. Because a story told one way could go down, a different fork in the road. But when you apply craft, it just brings it to another level. So I really enjoyed seeing how different international markets looked at craft. It was really interesting. There was a piece that we saw, and it had, I think the tiniest subtitles that we've ever seen on a submission. And we all started to lean in because the story was so engaging. And we just kept leaning in. And it was so heartwarming. And it was told in a beautiful way. And it was shot in a beautiful way that just felt really natural as well, not overly crafted. But I think that's one trend I'm really happy. I don't even know if that's a trend. But, we're coming back to craft. And we're coming back to detail and how that matters.
Yeah, it's been nice finding new ways to do it, but also doing it the old way, like we can actually go back to producing things properly, and it's nice. Now, without disparaging any work, what should brands or the ad industry consider, maybe they could be doing better when creating this branded entertainment? What are you seeing that maybe you wish you were seeing more of?
I think the biggest thing is just being authentic and being human. I think it's very easy for us to get in a room behind a brief and over-litigate some of these ideas, but at the end of the day, is it cool or not? Is it interesting or not? Like, again, would you want to watch this if you made it? And I think sometimes people get so caught up in the art, they don't really actually take a step back. And I think that's one thing that I've always tried to do in my career is I'm kind of let's just take a step back and look at this subjectively. I think that's the big thing that people need to kind of take into consideration as they move forward. And again, you're starting to see some of that work, but, I think that's the main thing is that, let's start having fun again. Yeah, I just, to Helen's point, I think now that the world is opening up again. We don't have to shoot everything on a cell phone. We don't have to shoot everything over Zoom. And I did plenty of those shoots over the last few years, right? Like now we can start having fun. We can get people in the room and some of those best ideas kind of come out the rock tumbler, as I call it. Like when you take those ideas and tumble them around across the team, right? And so I think that's what I'd like to see more of in the future.
I've noticed, it's like there's all this artifice and all this technique and stuff, and the idea ain't that good. It's like you spend a lot of time and money on kind of polishing, I'll just say, a rock. How about you, Helen? What advice would you give?
For this category, really lean into the entertainment part, right? Because it has to be entertaining. There were a few entries where we were almost falling asleep, and that is not what you want. So I would say, really making sure that it's entertaining first and foremost. Is someone going to pass this around? Is someone going to recommend, hey, Brandon, I just saw this spot that, you want that? And I think when your content is a certain length, that doesn't make it branded entertainment. So if your content is great and the brand has a role in that content and it's entertaining and there's value in viewing it, I think that's what makes the best work the best work.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Is there a magic number of brand to content? You know what I mean? Like, have you seen an example where the brand is very present and almost overwhelming, but it still works, or somewhere it's more subtle, like maybe from your jury or just in general?
Yeah, we've seen it big range. There was a feature film where the brand was present throughout the entire feature film. And then there are some examples where it's just a light nod. I think when it's a light nod, you question what the role of the brand is. I don't know, Brandon, if you saw the same.
Absolutely. I think there were some things where it was so nuanced. I remember at the end of a few submissions, even the jury would say, so, like, what was the brand? Or what was the company? What did they do? And so, again, I think you have to be very intentional, right? Like, about making sure those things still make sense, they connect. Because, content has a job. There was one piece that was very highly produced, very highly stylized, but even sitting back, you're asking, what in the world does this have to do with that brand? I think that's the main thing, is that we just have to start working on that again.
Yeah. Yes, it's got to be entertaining, everything Helen said, but yeah, it's got to work as an ad or as a piece of branded content. The word brand is in there for a reason, and that's a delicate balance, and not everybody gets it right. I think you're absolutely right. So, guys, this has been amazing. You have so much wisdom and information on this topic, but we can't know everything to ask, so we'd love to know any thoughts you have, final word, on the creativity, the industry-branded content, just anything that's on your mind.
I think there's a lot of really smart, amazing people in this industry, and I think, as the industry just starts to open itself up more, not to be an ad for Majority, but one of the reasons why we actually named the agency Majority is because as a person of color, or as a person, of a diverse background, the reality is that when you get a brief and you're not cis white male, you're all of a sudden multicultural. And so with Majority, even in that sense, right, like we were very intentional about kind of flipping the talent model and saying, what if you put people of diverse backgrounds in leadership roles as the senior people on stuff, and then said, we can still do general market work. And so I think that's what I kind of hope the industry starts to adopt more and more. We've seen a lot of people who really love that approach and they're really interested in it. But, my hope is that it kind of becomes a little bit of a torchbearer for the rest of the industry. And just, again, saying, that this industry, the reality is it hasn't been very diverse for a long time. Those things are kind of starting to change. But I think just having people from all types of walks of life, backgrounds, experiences, just makes the work better. And so, that's my biggest hope, is that, and I think we were starting to see some of that with some of the nuances in some of the work. That's not just a thing here in the U.S. Again, that could be an international element as well. So that's my biggest hope, is that, the different brands and the agencies that are working on stuff just continue to do the best they can to, again, just make sure they're bringing the best, but also the most diverse minds to the table to help come up with these ideas, because that's the reality of the world they're actually talking to.
We work in a great industry. I love marketing. There's nowhere else I'd want to be. And I think we need to really celebrate that. Go back to making people laugh, telling real stories that are really moving and touching. I always love coming to these award shows because I leave so inspired by the jury, inspired by the work and the conversation. And so, again, I get to go back to work so inspired. I get to share a wide selection of work that probably my teams haven't seen. And it's reinvigorating.
Well, Helen Pak, Brandon Butler, thank you guys so much for your time. Tons of wisdom here. I'm inspired now. I kind of want to sneak into your jury. So thank you very much, and we appreciate you talking to us.
Thank you for having us.
Brandon Butler is a partner and chief content officer at Majority Atlanta, and Helen Pak is the senior vice president of creative, Walt Disney Company. They're both judges in the 2022 London International Awards. I'm Chris Smith from Plot Twist Creativity, one of the 3 hosts of Created for Creatives. The producer is Sarah Knights. The theme music is by Brian Yessian of Yessian Music, and the manager is Larissa Levy from the London International Awards. This is an Eardrum production.